Hello and welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the fourth episode of Dual Aspects. I'm Sean and I've got Dawson with me as always. And today we're going to get into the topic of wholeness in science, the notion of wholeness within nature. And I'd like to open it up by asking you about why wholeness is such an important topic, especially today, and why we need to get into it.
Yes, this is a very pertinent question, and it really sort of emerges now when we have this specialization in all the fields of academia and how we do research today. There becomes a tendency to fragmentation. It leads towards a fragmented approach, and a scientist, say, like David Bohm, was at the forefront of this problem within his own field of quantum theory. When we're already having division among physicists that is quantum theory complete or is it incomplete? And what does this say about the other fields, about epistemology? Perhaps most importantly for a scientist, how we know what we know. Can we confirm what we know about quantum theory? So I would say that that requires, again, looking towards epistemology and logic. So you have to go out of perhaps just doing specifically physics-based work. So it's sort of a problem that you have to address right away when you're doing research is how is this going outside of my discipline?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we have a trend that seems to seal off different disciplines from each other, especially because the whole practice of scientific knowledge production has expanded and grown so much that it has become essentially impossible for anyone to overlook their entire field, even often their entire niche. If you get into semiconductor research in physics, for example, you may not be able to even grasp all of the current research and knowledge only within semiconductors. And it's even more extreme in areas such as theoretical physics or mathematics, where the language is so specialized. Especially in mathematics, you are basically experimenting with language and with definitions. It's so specialized that not only can you not overlook the entire field, but from within one niche, you may not even understand the publications of another niche. You may not even be able to follow it, even if you took the time to read it. It'll have a high entry barrier. And we often miss the opportunity to think about how this actually represents a kind of a problem, especially in an age where paradoxically, many people claim to have a scientific worldview, claim to have a kind of a non religious or in place of a religious worldview, a scientific worldview, whilst at the same time, it's no longer possible for anyone to even overlook all of science.
This is exactly the kind of problem one faces when they start having dialogues with scientists, philosophers, and they ask them what is their worldview, what is exactly their first principle. Well, they say I essentially rely upon, excuse me, science for determining what is considered credible and what is considered to be legitimate. And they say, well, what does this do to your understanding of religion or your understanding of politics? And David Bohm again asked these questions, and it made people in his field uncomfortable. So this is where it was the tragedy of David Bohm's life as being this prominent physicist studying under Einstein, going to the Copenhagen Institute with Mr. Bohr, and then asking questions beyond his field, and even winning the sort of disdain of Oppenheimer. So it kind of he lost credibility because Oppenheimer kind of rejected his new interpretations of quantum theory. So he himself so already faced the consequences when you just begin to ask questions within your own field, and it results in a lot of resistance or even rejection altogether. And I think this is some of the fear that people have about revolutionizing the way of thinking in their own field, is what is going to be the consequence for my contemporaries.
Yeah, I mean, what Bohm was trying to do was essentially he was trying to save physics in a certain way, or save the unity or the cohesiveness of physics in a certain way, because even going beyond or like leaving out a closer discussion on relativity, quantum mechanics already puts into question a certain inherent unity that had been assumed in physics prior to the emergence of quantum mechanics. So, for example, you have this problem of the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox or the Bell's inequality. Many people would see that as the crux of understanding quantum mechanics, that there is an inherent difference between classical and quantum ways of measuring, insofar that in a classical sense, there is already a preset result, and the measurement, the observation, only reveals it. It only conveys that pre-existing result to our understanding. But in quantum mechanics, it is basically proven by Bell's theorem that no such thing exists. There is no such thing as a local hidden variable. There's no such thing as a not yet revealed result that we only, uncover with the experiment. It seems that the observation, the measurement, actually creates the result. And what Bohm was basically saying, and I think I mentioned that in a previous episode, is that what if there is no hidden local variable, but there is a hidden global variable? How can we bring back the global? And I think a lot of modern physics, modern science has moved away from even this kind of approach and this kind of attempt. And I'd say Einstein would have been still sympathetic to it, but if you look at things like relational quantum mechanics, like Carlo Rovelli, they basically abolish any kind of objectivity, any kind of coherent, unified world, essentially any wave function or state function that describes a quantum state is regarded as entirely relative to the observer, which in its formalism is true, but it doesn't necessitate us to drop the notion of a coherent universe altogether, because I think in a sense it's a futile practice, because in order for us to understand anything, I think we have an inherent presupposition that wants us to integrate our understanding of nature into a whole.
Yes, and if we're bringing this conceptual grid to our study of physics, which some would say we need to make sure we do our best to not bring any kind of conceptual grid that could distort the phenomena or distort our conception or perception, more importantly. But this is what David Bohm was arguing against. He's saying that no, reality is one connected whole, and we have the ability to essentially look at it in fragmentary ways, but that doesn't reveal nature. That is just essentially a privileged position, if you like, momentary position that gives us a glimpse into it. But he says the notion of like the mirror of nature that philosophers had with the time of Descartes, that we could sort of get a copy of reality depending on what kind of understanding we bring to it. He's saying that that's not exactly false, and it's still viable. It's we're getting a glimpse of nature from our perspective, and the only time it's distorted is when we actually bring distortion to it, because he gives the analogy of the ballet dancer. The ballet dancers work in unison. They come into unison, they move out, and this cohesion, excuse me, and that's how nature is. It's not so much like this atomistic view we have of people in a city square, how they kind of merge and then they break apart, and they never have a cohesion. It's always, diverging. So, I mean, he believed this. Maybe that's the proper word here, is the belief and the orderedness of nature. And you could see resistance from other scientists or philosophers saying that this is an anthropocentric problem. It's not real. It's something we need to abolish or get beyond in studying science.
Yeah, I think it's important that you brought up the notion of belief, because conventionally many people would think that it has nothing to do with science. Science is exactly kind of the opposite. But as we know about any kind of formal logical systems, is they can't really prove the the foundations that they're built upon. Like you can't prove the fundamental definitions or axioms from within the system, because it derives from the fundamental definition and axiom. So those axioms need to be built on some kind of even more foundational truth. And that's essentially something where you can set an infinite regress of, oh, there's some meta system that defines those axioms, or that from which those axioms are derived, but this meta system also requires then some prime definitions and axioms to derive its own claims from, and so you've kind of gotten a regress here. And I think belief is essentially the kind of courage. It's actually an active pursuit. It's not a passive thing. You don't just identify as someone who believes in something. It is actually an indicator of a particular active way of being, an active way of engaging with knowledge and with science, and that is basically the bedrock of your knowledge system, of your intellectual system. The bedrock is this belief in the validity and truth of its foundational axioms. And I think that's essentially something that requires a certain amount of courage, because you can't derive them for certain, and you are kind of exposing yourself to the risk of many claims down the line discovering an inconsistency that throws you back to your initial axioms, that kind of exposes a weakness in your initial axioms that is only discovered after you've put a lot of work into pursuing all of the claims and statements that can be derived from your initial axioms. So it is kind of, you're putting yourself at risk, a risk of kind of wasting your time, a risk of humiliation. A belief, in a sense, is only, you could say, authentic when it involves a certain kind of courage, a certain kind of boldness. And I think science at this point is suffering from its lack of boldness, in the sense that we're still kind of standing on the shoulders of giants that were bold for their time. And Kuhn very brilliantly expressed that when describing the scientific revolution, or the Galilean revolution, scientific
Yes.
revolution of Galileo Galilei, where he says basically, no, it wasn't really like this stereotype of, we had the Dark Ages and people were just, getting their truth from their dreams or something, and or from the Bible only. And then Galilei, he just showed up and suggested, how about we start observing nature? That's not at all how it went. It was actually a scientific revolution in its original sense. Like, the scholastic establishment was an established school of understanding the natural world that had their own elaborate theories, and Galilei was bold enough to put into question its fundamental axioms and kind of break away from them and suggest and open up the path to new ones. And it's not just him, you have others. You've got Bacon, you've got Newton, but that is something that is lacking today. We're still deriving from a lot of the axioms that were set around this scientific revolution. And I think quantum mechanics, excuse me, I think quantum mechanics has a kind of a draw to it, a kind of mystique around it, because it's like it's the most recent bold renewal of a kind, within modern science, since which we haven't had this sort of impact. The system has just grown so much. It's proliferated into a kind of a technocratic, bureaucratic, framework that is difficult to change, and cannot really dynamically adapt to novelty very well.
Well, this is where the resistance comes from the established theory. If one says, I'm going to try to provide perhaps counter arguments or an extension of quantum theory, it's liable to get resistance from the established community because it works very well. It's functional, it's pragmatic. Why would we want to risk losing that solidity, if you like, losing the bedrock that we have? And I know that Bell has hinted at this with his speakable and unspeakable. There's these lectures on quantum theory. I haven't read them yet, but these are, I think they were published in the late 80s, early 90s, where he's trying to sort of broach the question of what are the limits of quantum theory, and maybe perhaps we could think of what is adequate criteria for speaking about it. Since today people are sort of in the community at a loss for words when they're trying to describe it, as it really is with concepts like wholeness. As soon as you hear that, you have your own connotations. For David Bohm, he was thinking of it as process. So this is something to worth emphasizing. It's process. So this notion of discovering through your research, you know that you're always at another limit. And if you can accept that, then you are not going to be resistant to revolutions that could occur in the field of science, for instance, or you're not going to try to suppress those that might want to pursue a new line of inquiry, which is what Lakatosh and Feyerabend and Kuhn were essentially bringing to the popular audiences, the problems of science, because the history of science was not very well established until the 50s and 60s. And it took Popper and it took Kuhn to open up the dialogue. And this is essentially what David Bohm emphasizes, that dialogue needs to be practiced at a philosophical level amongst scientists so that these reinterpretations can occur and then we can actually improve and broaden the theory. Otherwise, it won't happen. You get this sort of this stasis that is reached now with public figures, and people think that quantum mechanics is this Feynmanian problem. Like they say, they quote Feynman that says, no one understands quantum mechanics, not even myself. And it's sort of a sacred domain of knowledge that the layperson wouldn't dare question, and specialists perhaps don't really know how to describe it in a philosophical manner, which is all the more reason to be skeptical about it, to have this kind of mitigated skepticism that David Hume was advocating in his time. It's like we don't really know what nature is. We have approximations. If anyone claims to really know, then you could consider them a charlatan in some sense because they don't have access to the underlying reality, even though they might think that what they have is adequate and it is agreed upon. So it would be important to ask, this question of, well, what is the research program, and who is it benefiting in this body of scientists that want to keep the theory in its current state, or does someone want to question that? And this is why philosophy is essential.
Yeah, I mean, to your point about the importance of, looking under the hood of modern science by exploring its history, I think a very interesting historical divide that you can observe is this kind of divide between you could say, continental and Anglo-Saxon Enlightenment or scientific revolutions. There was a kind of a consistent dispute and a consistent, let's say, opposition between the understanding of many scientific concepts on mainland Europe, especially the famous divide between Leibniz and Newton. And but that divide between Leibniz and Newton was almost like a symptom of a deeper kind of difference. So you had Newton and Leibniz both converging in one point where they both came up with calculus, infinitesimal calculus at around the same time. But they actually diverged in many other aspects. And the more interesting one for me, obviously, is that is something I research, is their understanding of of space and time, but especially in the Clarke-Leibniz debate, because Newton was not too busy to engage with Leibniz directly. He would have Clarke exchange with Leibniz. They argue over the nature of space, and Leibniz famously considers space derivative. We've spoken about this on this show. It's derivative from concrete spatio-temporal events, and space just derives from it. It is, as Kant would say also a kind of a perceptual artifact, that we kind of derive from observations, whereas for Newton, space and time is a physical and an absolute physical receptacle, an absolute physical kind of thing, in a strange way, derived from Descartes' Cartesian space-time. But and in the exchanges, right, Leibniz would explain that, and then Clarke would be, yes, you are right that space is derived from actions and events and objects, but these are actions and events and objects within space, right?
Yes.
This is like you're kind of like having it backwards, right? And and another famous one is the discussion on the nature of light, where Newton had this corpuscular theory of each color being its own kind of having its own property, each kind of particle of light, which is the fundamental building block of light, according to Newton, being a little so-called corpuscular body, and each one of them having a particular color, and only in the sum do they result in what we know as the white color. So you could say it is a reductionist bottom up idea of light. And you had the flip side with the idea of light, from Goethe, where Goethe
Hmm.
was actually saying that the white light, that is the pure form of light. That is, you could say, the holistic form of light that cannot be divided. And once you send it through a prism, what you do is you are basically interacting with the pure form of light. That's how the pure form of light behaves under this particular manipulation. So their understanding of what we have normalized nowadays, under this reductionist science, where you segment everything off into its subparts and then have a bottom-up theory about them. This is regarded by Goethe as a manipulation, as a distortion, as a kind of, you could say, um, too invasive preparation of the object of nature, and thus an
Yes.
invalid way of observing and studying it. And due to historical or even political or whatever reasons, it has become clear that the Anglo-Saxon approach, potentially based on pragmatic considerations, has been dominant for the last 200 years, and has dominated what we understand as science. But that this continental approach has kind of faded in history, even though you had multiple others, Hegel and Schopenhauer, who weren't known to agree on much. They both shared this more continental approach. There was this commonality where they rejected this, you could say, Anglo-Saxon English approach.
Absolutely. This is a great example of how science and philosophy can be at odds with each other, and there could be a very fruitful result that ensues. First with Leibniz, he is really, you could argue, has won in the end, even though you don't throw out Newtonian mechanics by any means, but with his concept of the monad as being as anticipating energistic physics, is what we really have is energy. And he was critiquing really Newton's whole project, saying almost all of it is non-empirical with his categories of space, time, motion, force. He says force is the really only important part here, and what it really is energy, and not atomic bits, not particles that are really physical that you can observe, but more of just meeting points amongst energy. Again, he didn't have this terminology to rely on. He didn't even have the vocabulary to describe this. What he was getting at could only be described as monad. Um, and then you have today you can see that his critique of Newton had a lot of anticipatory value for quantum theory. And then you look at how Goethe critiqued the in the Farbenlehre the notions that Newton had established, and that Schopenhauer became very infatuated with, and he, as a young student, was writing to Goethe and providing his own critiques of Newton's color theory, of which he enthusiastically was in correspondence with Goethe as a young man, already as a teenager. At 19, he was claimed to be a genius by Goethe. So this, and it came from critiquing science. He was more scientifically minded than Hegel or Goethe,
Mhm.
uh, in his own way. So he essentially wanted to be empirical in his philosophy to the degree that was possible, but also keeping metaphysics. And I think this is something that's difficult to do today because, as you mentioned, positing the thing, the substance, giving substantializing, if you like, something. This is a theory. This is what Bohr was essentially moving away from. He was saying that there's no substance to the the observations we make in physics. They are just useful ways of talking about reality. And and until we can find more adequate ways of talking about it, we have to accept what we have. And I think this this is important though because someone has to make the scientists aware of the abstractions that they're using. And who's going to do that within the community? A philosopher of science is perhaps the ideal here. They can see this, and then it could lead to a paradigmatic shift if it was truly fruitful. And this would only come from a willingness to accept a counter argument, which is the test of all great men and great thinkers, is are they willing to accept counter arguments and reconsiderations of their theory, or they would reject it.
Yeah, I mean, another reason why you could say in principle, the approach of Goethe has become more relevant again with time. And that is something you do see again and again in science, where, for example, Lamarckism in evolutionary theory was kind of discarded. But then, as soon as epigenetics was discovered, there was a kind of a resurgence of neo Lamarckism. And you have the same thing now with the holistic approach, the top down, a non reductionist view with the arrival of chaos theory. I think that is something that is very, very unexplored. And I would actually assume that that potentially is the area that will be the most fruitful. That will be the area, just like people believed that physics has been completed or was already exhausted at the turn of the 20th century. And then quantum mechanics came around and just knocked this belief and showed that we barely know anything. I think chaos theory is like the early beginning of something like that. I think it's the early beginning of something truly big, truly massive, something that is so big that it can't even remain within the confines of physics. It invades all kind of information theoretical spheres, and as information theory and complexity has invaded since the rise of of computer processing has invaded every science, it will this whole principle of chaos theory will invade every science. You have the fundamental impossibility to reduce processes to their constituent parts. It's just that is in chaos theory like blatantly out the window. You can forget about it, and any kind of change in the initial conditions may destabilize or change the outcome of the entire system. So we have lost control basically over the constituent parts of a system, even in very basic systems with only three variables. There are basic systems with only like you've got the three body problem. You've got the there's a kind of way of dealing with it with three magnets that are arranged in a triangle. You've got population dynamics, looking at biophysics or just pure biological population dynamics. If you have three factors that are all interrelated, you get chaotic processes, and you may change a little tiny bit about the initial conditions, and the whole system will behave differently. And as we are digitizing, as we are basically forced to truncate the exact values at a certain point, there is an infinite uncertainty. There is just, no matter how precise you get, it doesn't help. You lose control over the behavior of the whole system if you
Objective
remain.
uncertainty, you said.
Sorry.
Oh, it's objective uncertainty, is this category that Kierkegaard coined.
Right. It is an objective uncertainty, and also we have the flip side. We've got this notion of the attractor, or also the strange attractor. An attractor that basically it's a pattern. It's an epistemological problem. It is a pattern that if you basically are capable of creating a so-called exosystem, meaning you're capable of looking at a system entirely from the outside. That's where the distinction of exo and endo physics has become relevant, a term coined by one of the founders of chaos theory, Otto Rösler. And you will observe a pattern, suddenly an ordered structure that you had no way of predicting from the beginning. And despite the uncertainty of the initial conditions, despite the impossibility of you controlling for the initial conditions, the system still tends to this ordered structure. It still converges towards this ordered structure. And it's called a strange attractor, which would indicate that it's a rare phenomenon. It is rare insofar that it's not easy to mathematically find these systems. We've got the Lorentz attractor and the Rösler attractor, named after Otto Rösler, but we don't have that many examples. But there's a good reason to assume that it is not just ubiquitous, but fundamental actually to almost everything we're dealing with in science. That's what I'm saying about this groundbreakingness of it. So, for just as an example, um, I'll just I'll just add this, and then I'll let you chime in on that. But for example, like, obviously, I'd say this is obviously the case with our human brain. This is obviously the case. We've seen many and many attempts at reducing neural behavior, reducing brain cognitive processes to the actions of neurons, through to the material processes within nerve cells in the brain. But it is clear, as they're all interconnected and connected via feedback loops, tiny initial conditions will massively change the behavior, and we've not been capable of keeping those systems under control, because a little deviation in a feedback loop can always get out of control and just explode. But somehow our real physical brain that we know and we're using, somehow that manages to consistently remain stable, in a sense, remain stable and operate in these strange emerging attractors that we can't seem to reproduce in a reductionist framework.
This is brilliant because it brings us to the center of consciousness studies. This is why consciousness studies becomes primary to many scientists, to David Bohm particularly, when he was merging into science, from science, excuse me, into consciousness studies. They said, as a physicist, why is it that consciousness is concerned you? He says, because this is the pattern, and the formation of reality comes from consciousness. It's impossible to get outside of. And this is why he was sympathetic to Kant. He was concerned, he mentions Kant in his writings quite a few times. He was concerned with the a priori structures that are there throughout each epoch. It's not so much that Kant's a priori categories are valid now. They were valid for his epoch, based off, as we've mentioned many times in our other episodes, based off the science of his day. So if we know the science of our day, then we have a priori structures of consciousness that we're bringing to our observations. So in a sense, it's consciousness is the most fundamental, because it's like the Archimedean point. So what we have to rely on it, and you can have Daniel Dennett types of arguments. You can have Hofstadter and Daniel Dennett's book together. I haven't read. I think they kind of expand on Dennett's arguments for just a kind of a phenomenalist interpretation. We know only the appearances, which is sort of an extension of Hume. So we have only knowledge of the appearances, we have no knowledge of underlying reality. But still, the problem for them is consciousness. And then we have this is where religion now comes into the discussion is with the school of Vedanta, for example, within the Indian tradition of philosophy, they already had a notion of consciousness as primary to everything else, and it's a given for these thinkers. And so when they see people like David Chalmers making arguments for the irreducibility of consciousness, they say it only confirms what the ancients knew thousands of years ago. And so consciousness studies, they call it the hard problem of consciousness, right? I don't know if it's something that needs to be framed that way. The way they frame it is if it's this puzzle that must be solved, and then we must work to finally provide it with this empirical grounding or indubitable first principles for consciousness. I don't think that would actually be fruitful. I don't think it is. I don't think there's a point at which you can exhaust consciousness studies. I think again with David Bohm, it's a process, and so we can have a better perceptual framework, if you like, for observing reality by ways of analogies, by way of saying that it is all in flux, to harken back to Heraclitus, which David Bohm does. It's like it is all in flux. So we can observe it in its transitional stages. And there might be, as you said, orderedness, or there might be patterns that we develop just from pure uh, unfiltered consciousness. Why is it that we formulate patterns? It seems to be inherent in our brains. Um, and then when we digitize that, when we start getting to the age where we make, comparisons to the mind as a machine and it could be programmable, I think it creates the illusion, though, that we can program the consciousness, and that we can rely upon predictions and this continuity, this when there really is discontinuity. I think it's more important to emphasize there's discontinuity. With chaos theory, perhaps it provides you with a a new answer to that there is only discontinuity. And anomalies are not predictable, even though it's a term from science. I don't think anomaly is the right word for chaos theory, is it?
Not necessarily, but I think well, I think that what the distinction between the hard and the easy problem is getting at is like the easy problem is a an attempt at reductionism. Basically, it's like, can we reduce our understanding of consciousness down to its functional properties? And there you have some interesting approaches. I think some to look at are, for example, Mark Solms, the kind of active inference, affective theories that look at, okay, consciousness is something affective. It is something of something like a what it is likeness, a qualia, a quality of a certain perceptual input, and this is kind of a function, he would say, of a regulation, a function of regulation that kind of actively infers or actively, you could almost say, predicts or anticipates a certain state, and any deviation from that effective state is what essentially then rises to our consciousness, right? That it is a kind of a functional way of approaching it. There are other ways as well. There was this theory by Tononi called the integrated information theory that tries to find a complexity measure, a measure of a complexity of a neuronal system, and determine whether that an increase in that complexity measure also means an increase of what we colloquially understand as consciousness. And then these theories can also be combined if you say that, for example, okay, perhaps our perceptions can be seen as something that can be more conscious or less conscious, or the phenomenal world, the way we perceive and are within the phenomenal world can we can be more conscious to it or less conscious to it, and that can be encoded in some kind of information theoretical complexity principle but none of these will approach the so-called hard problem, because the hard problem is essentially that we're speaking about a first person phenomenon. We're speaking about a subjective phenomenon, something that is centered and almost, you could say, individuated in yourself. And this Heidegger would refer to it as the Jemeinigkeit of Dasein. It's je meines, it's each my own, in a sense. It's each my ownness. I don't know how it's actually translated in English. I
Yeah,
just kind of made it up on the spot.
my professor translated it as being is in each case mine.
Yes,
This is
yes.
yes, yeah,
Something like that. And it is obvious if you look at it from a philosophical standpoint, or from the you know question of categorization of approaches, that this cannot be reduced. This is not something that you can functionally reduce to something else. And we've just spoken about the inherent futility of this reductionism. And so you have to kind of admit that it's a domain on its own. It's a domain of its own. And there you go back to Vedanta and yoga and other kind of practices that are much older than modern science, that seem to have been more advanced, you could say, on that sphere of hard problem, or have had made some kind of developed knowledge in that sphere, that we would not conventionally regard as science. But if we follow our friend Paul Feyerabend, then potentially this sharp distinction is something that we need to put in question.
absolutely. And David Bohm was a big advocate of dialogues amongst East and Western thinkers. This is what led to his long-term collaborative friendship with Krishnamurti,
Hmm.
in which he started asking political questions and the ramifications of this reductive worldview, thinking about it from all facets of society. And he used the analogy not only of the ballet dancer, but the dancer like Lord Shiva from Indian pantheon, sort of this image of the sort of the eternal cycle, Shiva standing on one foot and the wheel around him. This is essentially what he was saying, that there's a dance to the nature of reality or the operations of reality. So we need perceptual tools that help us apprehend it more cohesively. And he would resist reductive models, not just for personal preference. And I think this is a common problem, is sort of say to someone that isn't tough-minded enough to resist determinism or reductivism, it's not so much a preference, it's just not accurate in its explanatory power. And I think that's something to emphasize when critiquing science that goes towards this avenue of reductivistic worldviews, is that it's not accurate in its explanatory power. It only provides fragmentary glimpses. It provides with similar to a medical analogy. If you want to heal your body, you could have surgery done, or you could heal the immune system first and foremost. If that doesn't work, you rely on surgery, but you don't immediately identify the problem as we must amputate this arm, when you could have tried ways to heal it first and foremost. So they're both correct approaches, if you want to use that term. They're valid, but one can't be emphasized at the expense of the other. This is where it becomes a problem.
Yes, and it's I think the difficulty lies in integrating both movements, the converging and the diverging movements, integrating them, because they're always both at play. But it seems to be that we've kind of fallen into a disbalance. I think technology, the current state of techniques, is almost like a symptom of this disbalance. Um, and I regard technology as like a historical event. I regard it as an likeness.
Mhm.
There's obviously many interesting modes of analysis where you can look at it and analyze technology, but I focus on this kind of, okay, we are actually living in a period where technology is a serious issue to discuss, which perhaps wasn't the case as much in other times. And that is because we are observing a very paradoxical circumstance where it seems that the technology has erupted in a form of information bomb, you could say. If you look at if you look at television, for example, television was such a mass hypnosis machine that streamlined the thinking of so many people. And once so many people were like mass streamlined into like consolidated into this information network, we got the internet, which is the radical opposite. It's almost like an explosion that has scattered our thinking into so many separate and isolated subcultures, where it's like we don't actually have any classics anymore. Just if you think of it, the last classics come from the television age, you could say. You know, the last classics of music, the last classics that there are less classics, and the acceleration, the speed has led to any classic immediately kind of being faded and replaced with another one. Um, it's like we were incapable, for example, with every new Star Wars movie or every new Star Wars TV series, we've become less and less capable of capturing the feeling that Star Wars conveyed in the 70s to people. And even though the technology has gotten much better, even though a lot of the original footage of the old Star Wars movies, for example, is pretty goofy, it's pretty, pretty like you know, 70s but you know, it's we can't even capture that charm, because we've kind of scattered everything. And at the same time, there is also homogenization. It's also consolidation happening. You know, it's like McLuhan has spoken about these contradictory schemes, but like you can't separate it from our notion of science, because as Heidegger said, our understanding of science is inherently technological. And so I think there is this kind of lopsidedness where I don't know, how would you conceptualize it? Would you say that we are kind of biased too much towards reductionism, or would you say that like we have both? We have the divergent aspect and the convergent aspect. They just seem to be in a disharmony with each other.
I think it's mostly the latter. There's a disharmony because we rely on reduction for its explanatory power, or perhaps it's a consequence of modernization and technology. So it's unavoidable. And it's worth mentioning that Spengler is the first author to really write a book about technology with Der Mensch und die Technik before Jacques Ellul, before Heidegger. And he looked at it from an anthropological lens. And he was saying that it's an extension of the nervous system, like McLuhan. It's the tool. It's the primitive
Mm.
man had tools to make his environment more conducive to his being. So we could even say that the internet is it's the best outcome because it gets outside of the mass media hypnosis and the manipulative power that the mass media could exert on us, and the way that so I would say it's analogous to manuscript culture of the medieval age, where the central authorities had manuscripts and only learned men or specific men in power could read from them or have access to them. And with the Gutenberg revolution, what McLuhan calls the Gutenberg galaxy, this actually allowed lay persons like Martin Luther in his own way to start publishing his own work, which caused an information time bomb in that 16th, 15th, and 16th century. So this is actually an optimistic argument for the age of the internet is actually a way out of hegemony and manipulation that comes from mass media and from having no access to this. So it can kind of break the disharmonic outcome of media into more harmonic effect because one person can actually actively influence the outcome. They can leak information, they can publish their own work, they can, even though people dislike Ted Kaczynski for various reasons, he was an attempt to sort of get out of this hypnosis, and unfortunately, it led to his own insanity and the deaths of other people. But he was at one point he had such strong potential in his field, in his very esoteric mathematical field, and he started to realize the consequences of the 20th century, and that's when he became disliked and sort of entered his own psychosis. But I think the internet is a way out of central mass media and the hegemony that the political parties, for instance, used to have, is that men and women can now utilize it as a platform to sort of throw weapons against their opponents and provide counter arguments and actually open up people's perspectives in ways that would have been impossible prior to the internet. So it's abused in that it becomes too convenient for people to remain at home or to communicate so that they don't get qualitative experience, which is fundamental to life. So the qualitative aspect gets cut out of this very easily. This is the one major risk that we know. We can see it every day. This attempt to rely on secondhand or third-hand hearsay, as Spinoza would say, hearsay knowledge becomes probably the source of many people's knowledge of politics and even of science. This something I'm really so adamantly opposed to is the popularization of science with figures we don't want to give free press by mentioning their names, but certain figures in science that sort of banalize it and say, Newton was just working on his manuscripts to try to explain the Bible. That was all just extremely absurd pseudoscience, and we don't really need to talk about his life. They sort of are trying to monopolize on how science is really just reductive and anti-religious or even anti-mystical, and it's promulgated by figures, and that most people's understanding of science is that it's something I know not what, to use Locke's term. I know nothing about it, and I'm not going to rely on my own qualitative experience. I'm going to rely on the authorities to tell me what to think about it. That's one consequence.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, allow me to push back on your
Mhm.
point there a little bit because I think going back to the idea of the convergent and the divergent being kind of in a let's say disharmonious relationship with each other, we have this fragmentation of, you could say, the physical world in physics, but at the same time this craze for finding the theory of everything. So there is a kind of an attempt at consolidation, at convergence. But if you look at the kind of nature of the theory that we're trying to find, if you want to look at, for example, the standard model of physics, it's it's basically a not very aesthetic, you could say, amalgamation of various field theories. And I'm not trying to say that theories must be pretty. I mean, I think Sabine Hossenfelder would have a big problem with this, for example. But I mean, I'm not saying there's a kind of a need for aesthetics. But, however, I think the initial wholeness that we're seeking, that essentially is the, you could say, authentic driver of science, namely this attempt at actually reaching a kind of a bliss, a blissful harmony with yourself and the world. Um, that is not really something that can be achieved with very, very complicated and compressed, convoluted theories that are then amalgamated into a very, very long equation. Um, and and I think so. What you have is basically um, a blatant or a blatant kind of inadequacy of the direction in which the unification of physics is going, that derives from this inherent method of disintegration. It's this weird kind of entanglement of integration and disintegration that seems to be disharmonious, and I don't really have the right words to say it's disentangled proper state, its entwundene or verwundene um, mode should be or would be. And I think it's the same thing with the media. If you could rightly say that there was a kind of a lopsided convergence in the television age. Um, but if you look at the internet age, it's not exactly a resolution of this lopsidedness, but you actually, I see your point with the advantage of everyone becoming a broadcaster just like we are. But if you just look at the majority of the use on online, I would suspect would be something like doom scrolling, would be something like being on TikTok, on Instagram, on social media, and just kind of scrolling, which is you could say probably a more intensive trance than what television was even capable of. Um, and reaches younger ages and is potentially even more damaging to cognitive abilities in many ways. And so what you have is, despite the decentralization, the dispersion, the divergence that is happening through the internet, you have a kind of a unhealthy convergence, almost a metastasization within these kind of social media frameworks. So it seems to me again a kind of a convergent divergence out of whack, and I'm lacking the vocabulary, I must admit, to really address or pinpoint the exact, you could say, core or nature of this disharmony and how to disentangle it.
One thing it leads to is discontinuity. And maybe I can extrapolate from what you said about filmmaking and the approach to just enjoying entertainment is that there's a this illusion of novelty, I like to call it. The illusion of novelty sort of reigns supreme. You have each day we know that there will be new content available. And that means content in a really large sense, whether it's from the major media broadcast stations or from the YouTube feed or Instagram or Twitter X. We know new content will be available and it's available to us 24/7. Whereas before we had to wait to about 6 p.m. or 11 p.m. or 5 a.m. to get our newspapers or the new news broadcast. So information available at every second of every day. So it totally works itself over us, as McCoon would say. It's like the equivalent of, he's saying, like being X-rayed is this analogy he uses. You're always the light's beaming on you, and this was with the television generation, with children sitting in front of the television, and the content isn't so important as the activity and its ability to put us into hypnosis. So similar to doom scrolling, as you're saying, it puts one in a hypnotic state. And what are the consequences over compounded periods of time? You can measure them. It leads to different kinds of unfortunate side effects. So it's very much the case that if technology, if the internet, the computer is part of techne, and it is something we can utilize for purposes of function, for utility and convenience, well, can be used similarly for degrading, for destruction, for manipulation, and for mindless pursuits. And most people are inclined towards the the pleasure and the hedonic experience of technology as a way of convenience. So this is perhaps a perennial problem with human nature more than anything.
Yeah, yeah. Fair point, fair point. Um, but yeah, I see. Do you see a kind of a domination in the sense of one aspect over the other? A kind of a, not a dual aspect, but a subjugated aspect in a sense where, for example, we have the reductionism dominating over the holism, you could say, and so the holism is not destroyed. We haven't removed the holism, but like our approach at holistic theories is kind of characterized or almost I don't know, scarred, you could say, by its subjugation under the reductionist paradigm. And perhaps it's something similar with the internet and the way information is dispersed here, where it's like the holism, the kind of unification is kind of subjugated under the paradigm of its universal dispersion.
I think the subjugation is a stronger aspect than anything else,
Mhm.
and it's sort of the analogy of going through the labyrinth. How does one find their way through the labyrinth? Perhaps they need a mentor, or they need a valuable source of knowledge, of wisdom. Maybe they need wisdom from experience of going through the labyrinth in order to understand how to navigate properly. And I think it's a microcosm of the problem one has in their own discipline. Do they go to the historical foundations to then obtain knowledge so that they can navigate through their field more effectively, more adequately, and that requires them to really spend a lot of time with the literature in their field, which could take years. And it does require years, decades, to be acquainted with the core tenets of your field at a philosophical level. If you want to be a practitioner, perhaps as a civil engineer, you're not really required to read philosophy and science. You need to know how it is going to be employed every day at work. And that in itself relies on reduction, if you like. There are certain aspects of living in fields of knowledge that it needs to be reductive, it needs to be pragmatic for the sake of employability and usability. So there isn't really a question of what ought one to do in engineering. There isn't this imperative to ask that, perhaps, unless it's leading to graver consequences. I think this is perhaps only what philosophers say. This is a guilty of being a rational mind, is asking for order, asking for cohesion.
Mm.
And I think this is the debate amongst philosophers of science and just scientists, if we can categorize them, we'll say professional scientists, not asking those questions. Perhaps their field is what they would say is determined by forces beyond themselves, or what the innovations in their field are going to be is beyond them. They just are sort of carrying on the research program that has been handed down to them, so that where it's heading, to use Max Planck's term, where it's going, they don't know. And they're not concerned because it doesn't have immediate value or immediate use for them. And this is the way with technology. You could say it's providing convenience. So why would I ask what are the perhaps detrimental effects of technology?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's also it's kind of, you could say it's suffering under this lack of integration with its subjugated part. It's like, the pragmatic advantage of the reductionism has kind of led to it being blind to its own reductionism when attempting a kind of wholeness, a unity. So I mean, for example, there is no reason to believe that the unity can be distinguished from, or separated from other unities, that a theory of everything in physics can actually be achieved whilst just remaining in the field of physics, right? That's kind of the kind of specter, what is that is haunting this attempt of unification, that it's kind of being haunted by its fundamental reductionist attitude from which it's approached. And um and and I mean, there is a reason to believe that there's a reason to believe that unity is actually not something, it's kind of, it's self-perpetuating. It's not something that you can reduce or separate from other kinds of unity, and that is the whole, you could say, basis of religiosity. There's one of my favorite religious works is called Being Consciousness Bliss by David Bentley Hart, and he
Mm.
basically he identifies the root of the religiosity in the unity and inseparability of being, of existence, as well as the unity of consciousness and the unity of bliss. And for him, the unity of all three is the same unity. It's like the the recognition of the unity between being and consciousness is bliss, right? In a sense. And 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 that is also the you could say the issue that haunts, you could say, regular new atheists or rationalists, where it's like they want to hold on to the unity of science. They want to hold on to the unity of rationalists, uh, scientific nature, or natural, a naturalist unified world. Um, but they want to separate it from the unity of morality or aesthetics, of the unity of the beautiful, the good. They want to section off the true from the good and the beautiful, in a sense, and reduce the true to a kind of logical rationalist framework. And the question is whether that's even possible. Do you give up? Do you technically implicitly give up all of unity once you do that? You're just like in the on a first stepping stone towards full disintegration. Mm, or do you have to actually admit that implicitly you do presuppose a fundamental unity across scientific truth into moral and aesthetic truth? And I'm just wondering here what you think, whether there is a way of escaping this disbalance, this subjugation, without without falling prey to some kind of dialectic where we just start counter subjugating, like kind of where we start making the holism reign supreme instead, and just and go lopsided the other way, which is something I'm wondering about, because in a way it's something you could say it's evolution, it's natural selection. The holistic approach is kind of lost in the theater of history. But is there such a thing as having lost the fundamental truth with it, and we need to kind of reckon with that?
Yeah, reckoning with the loss of unity in in the sciences, and even the very practical critique level that at a polymath is that he or she could never really have working knowledge of the fields. They might have theoretical or literary knowledge, but can they make contributions to more than three fields, or at least three fields? This is a problem for the sake of sheer time and for one's energy dispersion. You cannot make significant contributions to many fields at once, they would say. I'm inclined to say no, and I'd like to find out firsthand. I think there is a kind of this this could be this what you said, the counter subjugation with dialectics. Say, well, we're going to show that physics can actually retain its philosophical foundations that it was built upon when it was called natural philosophy. And we can appeal to figures. Maybe this is a fallacy. Niels Bohr and others that used the term natural philosophy still less than 100 years ago. And so that it was leveled against them also by Americans, that the continental physicists were too philosophical, and they rejected their concerns that they had. For instance, when Bertrand Russell met with Wolfgang Pauli, Gödel, and Einstein in Princeton a few times, he dismissed them, the three of them, as having a penchant for metaphysics that only a German would have. And so his Anglo-Saxon ways and his utilitarianism that kind of comes as a result of John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham and David Hume, actually, it lends to a rejection of unity as a possibility. It rejects it largely even as a possibility. There is resistance at this level that is epistemological. To say we cannot know in a unifying way about reality, so we should really become naturalized. In a pun, it's not natural. It's more of modernized, is what they're saying. We should become Enlightenment thinkers. I think the strain of the Enlightenment is sort of manifested in many people, is that we should demystify science. We should demythologize religion. And it leads to people writing whole books on demythologizing the Bible and religion, which I would just say is kind of unfortunate. It leads to a kind of chimera or a Frankenstein, is that they try to salvage religion by way of natural science, which just kind of ruins the religion altogether
Mhm.
because of this a temptation to conform to the current standards of science. So I would say it is a disservice and an injustice to try to conform fields of knowledge or schools of thought within the framework of our immediate contemporary understanding of science. I would say it's like historically we have to inherit history by preserving it and also not trying to alter it according to the standards of our time, so that in itself becomes a counter dialectical problem, I think you would say, subjugating uh, the history of ideas by way of reducing them to contemporary standards, which I would think is noble to argue against. is keeping the historical consciousness alive rather than attempting to revise and to alter. And according, like, for religion is the easiest thing we can point out, is that it loses its sacrality. Essentially, it could very well be reduced to that I guess you would say what Julian Jaynes' thesis, that we were schizophrenic. Historically, we were schizophrenic until about the period of the modern era. We actually heard voices from the gods, and it was very important that we had these voices of the gods that were actually influencing us. And with the breakdown of the bicameral mind and moving in towards our age, we've actually lost that ability.
We've become autistic now.
Yes. Um, this there could be this statement made that these kinds of theories that Jaynes proposes and others propose, they're not attempted, they're not falsifiable. They're more for play and for creativity, and one could say that the more it lends to play and creativity, the more important it is for the dialogical side, for the discussion amongst the scientists and the philosophers and the religious practitioners. So there needs to be creativity is not something we want to routinize and say it's a must be done, but I would say yes, creativity has to be a category in your research, like Max Planck said, working knowledge in your field and creativity, they merge together. And if you're missing creativity, which we would probably say a lot of the popular scientists are missing, then it won't allow them to experience reality in the way that it really is required to take in all of the novelty and the anomalies and unexpected changes.
Yeah, yeah, very well put. And I think I think we need to get deeper into this in the next episode.
Yes,
And I thank you again very much for joining me in this exploration of wholeness and reductionism. And I hope we can get into many of the topics we've addressed. I hope we can get into this idea of naturalism and this idea of the creativity and the role of this kind of bold creative spirit that is part of exploring the sciences and exploring nature after all. And yeah, looking forward to our next episode.
absolutely. Thank you very much.